What you are witnessing right now is not another routine escalation in the Persian Gulf. This is the emergence of a military capability that forces every naval strategist in Washington, London, Brussels, and Tel Aviv to reconsider assumptions that have dominated global security for decades. Iran has revealed what appears to be a new generation of maritime strike technology in the Strait of Hormuz, and the implications reach far beyond the Middle East. The real shock is not simply the weapon itself. The real shock is that such a system may have been operationally prepared for years without triggering a full-scale strategic response from Western intelligence agencies. That failure alone is sending alarm through defense ministries across NATO because it suggests that the balance of power in one of the most important energy corridors on Earth may already have shifted before the public even realized it. Over the last 48 hours, military analysts and defense research institutions have been dissecting satellite imagery, telemetry reports, and operational assessments tied to Iranian missile deployments near the Strait of Hormuz. What they are describing is not a marginal upgrade to older anti-ship systems. This is being discussed as a complete transformation in how naval warfare could function inside confined maritime choke points. For decades, Western fleets relied on the assumption that advanced radar networks, layered missile defense systems, electronic warfare, and carrier strike groups could dominate regional waters against almost any conventional threat. But the system Iran appears to have fielded threatens to undermine that entire doctrine. Analysts are now openly discussing whether modern warships operating near the Iranian coastline could face engagement windows so short that even the most advanced defense systems in existence may struggle to respond in time. In the next several minutes, I am going to explain exactly why this development matters so much. We are going to break down what Iran has reportedly deployed, why military planners are suddenly reevaluating the survivability of carrier strike groups inside the Gulf, what this means for the 21 million barrels of oil that move through the Strait of Hormuz every single day, and why energy markets are beginning to quietly prepare for the possibility of a global supply shock, unlike anything seen since the oil crises of the 20th century. Because if the Strait of Hormuz becomes militarily unstable, the consequences will not remain confined to the Middle East. Fuel prices, shipping insurance, global inflation, industrial supply chains, and financial markets around the world would all be affected within days. To understand why this situation is so dangerous, you first need to understand the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically vulnerable waterways on the planet. At its narrowest point, it is only around 21 miles wide. The actual shipping lanes used by massive oil tankers are far narrower, roughly 2 miles across in each direction, separated by a limited safety buffer. Every tanker, cargo vessel, or military ship transiting the strait passes extremely close to Iranian territory for nearly the entire journey. In military terms, this creates what strategists call a kill zone. Ships moving through the strait cannot maneuver freely. They cannot disperse. They cannot rapidly alter course without risking collision or disruption of the entire shipping lane. That means any force controlling the surrounding coastline holds a tremendous strategic advantage over vessels trapped inside the corridor. For years, the primary maritime threat from Iran consisted of conventional anti-ship cruise missiles, naval mines, drones, and swarming fast attack boats. Dangerous systems, certainly, but still manageable within the framework of existing Western naval doctrine. Traditional anti-ship missiles usually provide some degree of warning time. A subsonic missile might take several minutes to reach its target, allowing warships to deploy decoys, activate close-in weapon systems, jam guidance radars, and attempt evasive maneuvers. Even supersonic missiles traveling at several times the speed of sound generally provide enough time for a trained combat crew to identify the threat and initiate defensive procedures. But hypersonic glide systems change the equation entirely because they compress the engagement timeline to almost nothing. According to multiple technical assessments now circulating in defense circles, Iran may have adapted its Fatah hypersonic platform into a maritime strike weapon specifically designed for use inside the Gulf. If accurate, this would represent one of the most important military developments in the region in decades. The original Fatah missile was publicly unveiled as a land attack hypersonic system. However, what Western analysts now believe is that Iranian engineers were simultaneously developing a naval strike variant capable of targeting moving vessels rather than fixed installations. Reports indicate that several test launches were conducted against moving maritime targets in the Gulf of Oman, with trajectories and terminal guidance patterns consistent with anti-ship warfare rather than land attack operations. The technical implications are staggering. A hypersonic glide vehicle travels at extraordinary speeds while maneuvering unpredictably during its descent toward the target. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles, which follow relatively predictable arcs, glide vehicles can alter direction and altitude during flight, making interception dramatically more difficult. At speeds reportedly ranging between Mach 8 and Mach 13, such a weapon could cover distances inside the Strait of Hormuz in mere seconds. That means a defending vessel may have less than 15 seconds between initial detection and impact. 15 seconds is not enough time for most naval defense architectures to complete the entire kill chain of detection, classification, authorization, targeting, and interception. In practical terms, commanders could find themselves under attack before their systems fully understand what is happening. And that is where the strategic panic begins. Modern naval warfare depends on layered defense. Radar systems identify incoming threats. Combat information centers assess trajectories. Electronic warfare suites attempt to jam or confuse guidance systems. Interceptor missiles launch to destroy incoming projectiles before they reach the ship. But those systems were designed around engagement windows measured in minutes or at least tens of seconds. Hypersonic weapons compress those windows so dramatically that even advanced fleets struggle to react. Military simulations conducted in recent years already showed how difficult hypersonic interception could become. Now analysts fear Iran may have operationalized those challenges in one of the world's most strategically sensitive waterways. What makes this even more concerning is scale. Reports indicate Iran has established numerous hardened coastal launch positions built into mountainous terrain overlooking maritime approaches to the strait. These facilities are reportedly designed for rapid launch and hide operations, allowing transporter launchers to emerge, fire, and disappear back into protected tunnels within minutes. Such infrastructure dramatically complicates any attempt at preemptive strikes because locating and destroying mobile launch systems hidden in fortified terrain is extraordinarily difficult, even for advanced air forces. This means Iran may possess not only the capability to threaten naval assets, but also the survivability required to sustain those threats during prolonged conflict. Now consider what this means for the United States Navy. Carrier strike groups are among the most expensive and powerful military formations ever created. A single group contains tens of billions of dollars in ships, aircraft, missile systems, and personnel. For decades, carriers symbolized uncontested American power projection. They allowed Washington to dominate maritime regions thousands of miles from the U.S. mainland. But hypersonic anti-ship weapons fundamentally threaten the logic behind carrier warfare inside enclosed seas. If commanders believe a carrier operating within range of hostile coastlines faces an unacceptable probability of catastrophic damage, then those carriers can no longer operate freely in those regions. And if carriers cannot safely enter the Gulf, America's military leverage across the Middle East changes overnight. This is why defense analysts are calling the development asymmetric warfare at the highest level. Iran cannot match the United States ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. It cannot build a navy comparable to America's global fleet. Instead, it is attempting something strategically smarter, building systems that make American naval superiority too risky to use near Iranian territory. In military history, weaker powers often seek ways to deny stronger powers access rather than defeat them directly. Mines, submarines, anti-ship missiles, and coastal artillery all served this purpose in previous eras. Hypersonic maritime strike systems may now represent the next evolution of that doctrine. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond military calculations. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Any credible threat to shipping there immediately impacts energy markets. Insurance costs rise. Tanker operators reconsider routes. Governments begin drawing up contingency plans. Even the perception of instability can trigger price spikes because markets react not only to actual disruptions, but also to anticipated risks. If shipping companies conclude that tankers face elevated danger while transiting the Gulf, transportation costs surge long before the first vessel is ever struck. That cost eventually reaches consumers everywhere through higher fuel prices, inflation, and economic instability. And this is where the next 30 days become critical. Military deployments in the region are increasing. surveillance operations are intensifying. Naval commanders are reassessing engagement doctrines. Intelligence agencies are attempting to determine whether Iran's reported capabilities match the alarming performance estimates circulating in strategic assessments. Because if those estimates are even partially accurate, the military balance in the Persian Gulf has entered an entirely new phase. The era in which Western naval supremacy inside the Gulf could be assumed may be ending, replaced by a far more dangerous environment where a single miscalculation could trigger not just regional conflict, but a global economic shock with consequences stretching far beyond the Middle East. The economic imbalance behind this entire confrontation is almost impossible to ignore. Iran does not need to build a navy capable of matching the United States ship for ship. It does not need aircraft carriers, global logistics chains, or fleets operating across every ocean. Instead, it has pursued a far cheaper and strategically sharper objective: building weapons that can make America's most expensive military assets too vulnerable to use inside a confined battle space. Analysts estimate that each Iranian hypersonic maritime strike missile costs only a few $1 million to manufacture. Compare that to an American aircraft carrier worth more than $13 billion before counting the air wing, escort vessels, crew, and logistical infrastructure required to keep it operational. In pure economic terms, the advantage heavily favors the defender. A regional power can threaten assets worth tens of billions using systems that cost a fraction of that amount. That reality is changing how military planners think about deterrence, escalation, and naval supremacy in the 21st century. But announcement number 3 is the development that has triggered the deepest alarm inside intelligence agencies, energy markets, and global shipping networks. Through diplomatic channels reportedly discussed in major international reporting, Iran has communicated that any direct military strike against its nuclear infrastructure or leadership would trigger an immediate effort to close the Strait of Hormuz. This warning is being taken far more seriously than previous Iranian threats because the strategic environment has changed. Earlier threats relied on naval mines, drone attacks, or swarms of small boats that Western commanders believed could eventually be countered through overwhelming force. The current concern is fundamentally different. If Iran truly possesses operational hypersonic maritime strike systems, then the ability of outside powers to guarantee safe navigation through the strait becomes dramatically less certain. And global markets are already reacting as if the threat is credible. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Gulf have surged sharply in response to the rising military risk environment. Major shipping firms have reportedly begun reassessing routes, delaying bookings, and reviewing contingency plans for possible disruptions through Hormuz. These are not symbolic gestures. Global shipping companies operate on razor-thin calculations of risk and cost. When firms responsible for moving massive volumes of oil and cargo begin adjusting operations, it signals that the danger is being treated as operationally real rather than politically rhetorical. The reason this matters so profoundly is because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route. It is the central artery of the global energy system. Around 1/5 of the world's daily oil consumption passes through this narrow corridor. If those flows were interrupted even temporarily, the consequences would ripple across every major economy on Earth. Strategic petroleum reserves maintained by industrialized nations could soften the shock for a limited period, but reserves are not permanent solutions. They buy time. They do not replace long-term supply. If Gulf exports were significantly disrupted for weeks or months, the world would quickly move from price spikes to genuine supply shortages, affecting transportation, manufacturing, aviation, agriculture, and global trade itself. Energy traders already understand this. Oil prices have climbed sharply as fears surrounding regional escalation intensify. Commodity analysts are openly discussing scenarios where prolonged instability in Hormuz could push crude prices into territory capable of triggering global recession. At extreme price levels, inflation would surge worldwide. Central banks would lose room to maneuver. Governments dependent on imported energy would face growing domestic unrest as transportation and food costs accelerated simultaneously. The economic aftershocks would spread far beyond oil markets. Every supply chain connected to fuel, shipping, and industrial production would experience secondary disruption. What begins as a military confrontation in the Gulf could rapidly evolve into a worldwide economic crisis. The reason Iran's threat carries strategic credibility is rooted in the same logic that underpins deterrence theory itself. States facing what they perceive as existential threats often signal that they are willing to absorb enormous costs in order to avoid defeat. From Tehran's perspective, direct attacks on nuclear infrastructure or senior leadership would not be viewed as isolated military actions. They would likely be interpreted as attempts to cripple the regime's long-term survival. Under those conditions, Iran's leadership may calculate that disrupting global energy flows becomes an acceptable retaliatory option regardless of the international consequences. That is precisely why military planners are taking these warnings so seriously. The danger is not irrationality. The danger is that each side may view escalation as strategically necessary under crisis conditions. Now consider the policy dilemma facing Washington and its allies. Public statements from defense officials continue emphasizing freedom of navigation, naval superiority, and the ability to keep shipping lanes open. On the surface, those assurances sound convincing. The United States Fifth Fleet remains one of the most powerful naval formations in the world. American air power in the region is immense. Allied surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities are unmatched. But once you examine the operational realities required to eliminate Iran's coastal missile threat, the situation becomes much more complicated. Neutralizing hardened missile infrastructure spread across hundreds of kilometers of mountainous coastline would require a massive sustained air campaign. These facilities are reportedly protected by layered air defenses, underground tunnel systems, mobile launchers, decoys, and rapid relocation capabilities. Any military attempt to suppress them would involve continuous strikes, electronic warfare, cyber operations, suppression of enemy air defenses missions, and likely significant attrition risks for attacking aircraft. And even successful strikes might not permanently eliminate the threat because mobile systems can relocate and re-emerge from concealed positions. In other words, there may be no quick military solution capable of fully guaranteeing the safety of shipping lanes under wartime conditions. That reality leaves policymakers confronting an uncomfortable truth. Unless the United States were willing to undertake an extraordinarily large and politically risky military escalation, Iran may retain at least some ability to threaten maritime traffic regardless of outside intervention. This is why some analysts believe the eventual outcome may not be decisive military victory by either side, but rather an uneasy deterrence equilibrium. In such a scenario, both Washington and Tehran recognize the catastrophic costs of escalation and gradually settle into a tense coexistence defined by mutual restraint. The United States limits certain forms of direct military pressure. Iran refrains from using its most disruptive capabilities. Neither side trusts the other, but both understand the price of open conflict could be unbearable. And that brings us to the broader historical lesson unfolding here. Geography has always shaped warfare. Again and again throughout history, narrow choke points allowed smaller powers to challenge stronger empires by exploiting terrain that neutralized numerical superiority. The modern Strait of Hormuz may represent one of the clearest examples of this principle in the contemporary world. Advanced technology combined with favorable geography can dramatically alter military balances. A regional power positioned along a strategic bottleneck can impose disproportionate costs on even the strongest global navies if the environment favors defensive systems over offensive projection. This is not simply a Middle Eastern story, it is a warning about the future of military competition worldwide. Hypersonic weapons, autonomous systems, long-range precision strike capabilities, and AI-assisted targeting are gradually spreading beyond the handful of superpowers that once monopolized advanced military technology. As those capabilities proliferate, regional actors gain new tools to challenge established powers in geographically advantageous theaters. The result is a world where dominance becomes more fragile, deterrence becomes more complex, and the risks of miscalculation become far more dangerous. So where does this leave the global system over the next several years? There are really three broad possibilities. The first is controlled deterrence, where both sides recognize the catastrophic consequences of escalation and avoid crossing critical red lines. The second is crisis and confrontation, where a strike, accident, or political miscalculation triggers a spiral neither side can fully control, leading to military conflict and severe economic disruption. The third possibility is technological adaptation, where new defensive systems eventually reduce the effectiveness of hypersonic threats and partially restore naval freedom of operation. But even that path would require years of investment, research, and deployment before changing the strategic balance. At this moment, the world appears suspended somewhere between deterrence and crisis. The capability Iran is signaling may be real, the vulnerabilities it exposes are real, and the economic stakes tied to the Strait of Hormuz are undeniably real. That combination is what makes this one of the most consequential strategic developments in the Middle East in years. Because when a regional power acquires the means to threaten the foundation of global energy stability, the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. They reach into every economy, every market, and every government dependent on the uninterrupted flow of energy through one narrow stretch of water.